Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's program. I'm very excited to have everybody here. Things are going very well with the American Friends of Lafayette. We have a great program coming up next weekend, February 1st and 2nd in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Go to Lafayette200.org to learn more. Lafayette was in Harrisburg in late January, and we're going to celebrate his time in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in big style. And like I said, on February 1st and 2nd, and you can find more information in Lafayette200.org. And then at the end of February, we head to Suffolk, and then everything starts again because Lafayette's on the move, and we are on the move. So starting at the end of February, we go into North Carolina, South Carolina, and all the way down through the Deep South and up the Mississippi River. So we're very excited. And again, go to Lafayette200.org to learn more. Tonight's program is brought to you by the American Friends of Lafayette, and I'd very much like to introduce our participants. First, in your lower left-hand corner is Mary Idzerda, the favorite child of Stanley Idzerda, and I'm very honored to have Mary here today. And it was a conversation I had with Mary a month ago that really made today happen. So thank you for being here, Mary. Next to Mary on the right is Robert Crout. He is the affiliate professor at College of Charleston. He also is the past president of the American Friends of Lafayette. He was the president of the American Friends of Lafayette when I joined, and he is a Lafayette scholar of insignificant note. So thank you for joining us, Robert. Upper right-hand corner is Lloyd Kramer. He's professor emeritus at University of North Carolina, a significant Lafayette scholar as well, and author. Thank you so much for joining us, Lloyd.
Thank you.
And last but not least, our fearless leader, talk about a Lafayette scholar. Ladies and gentlemen, the president of the American Friends of Lafayette and today's host, Alan Hoffman.
Personal housekeeping.
Well,
First, some housekeeping, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
This presentation is being recorded.
This presentation is being recorded. I wanted everybody to know that.
So they can review and comments will be recorded.
Yeah, so everything is recorded, and you'll, just so you know, so you can watch this later as well. I'm admitting more people in. We have an extensive audience today. I'll be watching everything in the chat as well. So if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A later in the program. Thank you very much. And now I turn it over to President Hoffman.
Thank you, Chuck. I want to begin before we get to the panelists, just to briefly tell you the connection I have to Stanley Idzerda, although I never met him. He played a role in the origin story of my passion for Lafayette. My wife would say obsession with Lafayette. It was 2002. I had just read Andrew Burstein's book called America's Jubilee. It was about the 50th anniversary of the country, and the whole first chapter, which was about 1/8 of the book, was about Lafayette's farewell tour. I was intrigued. I confess that that was the first time I'd ever heard of the tour. On September 17, 2002, I was in New York on business, staying with my brother-in-law, when he said, "What can I get you for your birthday?" My birthday was a day late. My birthday was the 16th. I said, "Get me a book on Lafayette." When I returned to his apartment that evening, he had two. The first one I read was this one, a wonderful catalog of an exhibition that the Queen's Museum did. And there were three wonderful essays. And the first essay was written by Stanley J. Idzerda. And I read this book and I was so impressed by Lafayette that that's what got me started. So I took a look at his essay a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this. And I want to read you the first sentence. Lafayette knew only one cause during his entire lifetime, human liberty. How to sum up a man in one sentence? It's a beautiful sentence. And, you know, when I think about that sentence, I think about other great openings like Call Me Ishmael, or It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Well, that's how I got my start. And the journey has led me here this evening to serve as moderator in this panel a task that I am very happy to be doing. The format will be that I will pose questions to the panelists and they will respond. We're going to try to keep to within 3 to 5 minutes for each response, but we don't really have a time clock. And I'm going to start with Mary. Mary, tell us a little bit about yourself and then give us like a biographical sketch of your dad up to the time that he arrived at Cornell for the Lafayette Papers project.
Well, I come from a family of 7, and I'm the third from the bottom, or the oldest of the last 3. It was a big family. My dad started off as a college professor, and he managed to raise every single one of us and get us all college degrees. Something that he should be very proud of. And I have to say my mom was part of it, because she was his partner in everything. And she kind of guided him, and she made sure that he wasn't too rough on Lloyd and Robert. My dad had the big things that stands out to my dad, and all us kids say, he set high standards. By setting high standards for himself, he just expected everybody was going to do the best and do the best that they could. And it's not that he said, you can't do it. He'd say, of course you can. And there's a big difference there. As my son would say, he'd say to my son, he'd say, of course, you know that this is the way you have to go. And it wasn't talking down to him. It was just saying, of course, this is how it has to be. So he set high standards for us. And the thing that I think that makes us unique, us as a family, we always sat together for dinners and meals. And that included when we had guests. It didn't matter who we had. We could have Robert, we could have Lloyd, Stanley Mellon, Bernard Wishy, even Gottschalk. These guys would sit at our tables, and I don't think they were used to having kids participate in these meals, but that's just how my mom and dad did things. And we didn't know any different. Honestly, I mean, we grew up in an academic household where we were used to college students coming in. Occasionally, college students actually stayed with us. If my mom and dad thought that a college student needed help, my dad would say, fix up the room, and they would stay with us. No questions asked. And we really didn't know any different. As for us, when you look at my dad, he was a Pearl Harbor survivor, Guadalcanal. He got started. He was from Brooklyn. Poor kid. He and his dad and his brothers worked in the booze business. They were lobster fishermen, but he worked for Joe Kennedy getting booze. I mean, that's how they survived. And he went on to Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, and he continued. And he was fortunate in that he was able to get off the boat after one of the serious battles of Guadalcanal, and the guy sent him off to school. And that's where he went to Notre Dame to get a degree in engineering, not history, which we always thought was kind of funny, but that's what he did. And his breadth of knowledge is incredible to me. He had bookcases just lined Greek history, not French history, Greek history. But he was interested in Greek, French, American history. He was interested in poetry. It just seemed like his breadth of knowledge was more than just one thing. And, he involved us kids wherever he went. In Michigan during the 60s, my two siblings, who were teenagers at the time, went with my dad down to Mississippi and helped the Black folks get registered to vote. And it was very, very dangerous. Asked later about it, my dad said probably wasn't the brightest idea to bring my children along, but it was important to him that they take part in these things. And he believed in that kind of thing. You know, for me, my first recollection of a lot of these folks was when we were in Wesleyan. We lived in Wesleyan and we lived on campus. They provided us with a house. And it was there that we got to know a lot of these people. And as my brother Bill said, he said, you know, these guys were all intellectually brilliant, super, super brilliant, but don't ask them to change a light bulb. They just were not in that manner. And I think because a lot of them were single, they came to our house. Now, admittedly, if we went to New Haven, because at the time Dad was teaching at Yale, if we took a visit there, unfortunately, on the way home, Dad would sometimes say, hey, just let's stop in to see Stanley Mellon for a bit. We'll just have us chat. And one thing us kids can all tell you, historians can't just have a chat. There's no such thing as just a chat. But at home, Mom continued when we were at Wesleyan having these people over. And, you know, we'd sit and listen. And we could talk. We were allowed to talk and participate. But it's kind of hard to get a word in edgewise with these guys when they're discussing stuff. My brother Bill mentioned, he remembered, he said, how many times did we have to go over one word? You know, somebody would be trying to get something published or something written, and they'd have 4 or 5 people there discussing that publication. And we'd look at each other, one word, seriously? Come on now. But that was just kind of our life. And, you know, we fast forward to Cornell. I loved the fact that we were going to Cornell because we left a small town in Minnesota, went to Cornell, and I was at the time 17. So I was getting ready to go to college, and there was 2 other siblings that were trying to go. And so my dad needed help with that. And Cornell, in case you didn't know, paid for one's tuition at Cornell or paid for the equivalent of the New York State University tuition in any other school. So that helped a great deal. But, you know, if you asked my dad, and we did ask him why he chose Cornell over the University of Chicago or going back to Michigan State, and he said, you know, Cornell wanted me because they wanted somebody that could finish the project before and not die. You know, and that was him. And personally, I think Cornell chose him because, one, they knew he could publish. He had the background. And finally, he knew how to raise funds. And Dad could get that done. He was good at that kind of thing. I know because I used to drive with him to these various places when he was trying to do the fundraising bid, and he was good at it. So that's what he did. But his days at Cornell, what I remember of them, and I was going to community college at the time and going to summer school at the time and all that other stuff. But when we were home, Dad's days were long, just like they were wherever he's worked. He'd get up, go for a run, work in his garden, and then sit down and start marking up papers. That was, he'd be editing and all that stuff. Occasionally, he would have one of these guys over for meals. And my memory of it was, and I had to laugh, Robert endeared himself to my mom. And it was primarily because he was an out-of-stater from South Carolina, and she felt bad that he was so far from home. And that was my mother, her, you know, open arms. And, these guys would come over, and something my siblings learned was that if you ask Robert a question about a historical figure, you could get all you needed for that history paper that you needed at school. The only problem was you couldn't ask why, or, how, if you said, what was the most important thing that the person did, or why did they do that? Then he and Dad would get into this discussion, and us kids would be like, look, we only need, so much to write. But, that was a typical thing. And we were used to that kind of life. And Dad, I honestly believe he wanted to do those papers because he was doing it as a payback, or as to do something that he felt that his mentors wanted. He had John Hall Stewart as his professor, and Gottschalk was a very important person to him. And I think he was doing that to show these guys, hey, I'm doing this because you expect me to do it. Mm-hmm. And he continued working on those papers, even when he left Cornell and went to St. Ben's. He would teach, but he'd also work on those papers, as one can see from the boxes and boxes of papers that we still have in the study. And I've offered them to Lloyd and Robert because my dad would like to have the 6th volume completed.
All right, well, we're going to mention that a little bit later, but thank you, Mary, for that really insightful discussion of your background and your dad's. I want to ask Robert now to respond. Robert, you can respond to anything that Mary said too. I mean, that's fair game. But tell us what a Papers project is, and describe what the Lafayette Papers project was.
Let me add a few more things about Stan and the experience at Cornell that I think are important to anybody understanding or trying to understand why Stan got involved with Lafayette and what the connection of Cornell is to all of this. And that is Stan's father came to America from the Netherlands. And he was an avowed atheist, but he believed in the mission of America. It was that idea of a beacon of freedom. And in fact, what most people don't know is that when things got bad in Europe in 1939, Stan's father and one of his brothers went back to the Netherlands and got stuck there throughout the war. And in fact, they were used by the Nazis as part of their slave labor program. So Stan knew a lot about oppression, and he experienced it in his own family. Yeah. As a result of his having grown up as the son of a lobsterman in Hell's Kitchen, I always when we'd go out to eat somewhere, I'd say, Stan, why don't you try that lobster pate? And he would say, well, when I was a lobsterman, my daddy and I would come back and sell the lobsters, and what we didn't sell, we had to eat. So I had enough lobster in my childhood, I never wanted to see another lobster. Well, because of his experience on boats, Stan volunteered to go into the Navy. And in fact, he was there at Pearl Harbor on that fateful day. And the ship that he was on went down. And a lot of his fellow sailors were lost. And he swam through that burning oil on the top, got to a launch, and went on and was reassigned to another ship and was involved in moving across the Pacific. And he told me that at one point he was on a destroyer that was hit by a Japanese torpedo. And because he was on the upper deck, that ship went down in a minute. And if he had been in the lower decks, he never would have been able to get out alive.
Yeah.
So Stan knew that the officers on those ships that he served on had a sense of loyalty to the crews under them, and that sense of an obligation to one's troops. And so you see, he had an affinity for Lafayette before he ever got involved with the Lafayette Project, because he knew about things like commitment to liberty and equality. He knew about fighting despotism. He knew about loyalty to one's troops, all of those things that he would later see in the Lafayette letters. And so he was primed. And another sense of that was in academia. You see, when he was involved in academia, and this goes back to that group of European historians, many of whom were trained at Cornell. And by the way, I think it's important to remember Cornell was one of the few Ivy League institutions that would accept Jewish students. So there was a sense of acceptance of diversity at Cornell, even in the days when it was a single-sex institution back in the 30s. And also the idea that many of the people that he worked with in that period, Gershoy and Gottschalk and so forth, were Jews, but they were fully accepted by their colleagues. And so there was a certain distinction of Cornell from many of those other elitist Ivy League institutions that gave Cornell a special reputation. And so Stan also had this idea that it was a community. It wasn't a business. It wasn't an enterprise. It was a community of scholars, something that we've come to lose in academia, unless we've really tried to hold on to it. But it was the idea that an obligation of the senior scholars to help the junior ones. And Stan tells me about a time that he was attending a meeting of a distinguished organization called the American Historical Association, where he was going to be giving a paper, and that he shows up at lunch expecting to be there just with his mentor, and who is there but the cream of the crop of French historians who he's introduced to as a graduate student. And it was that sense that there's an obligation to pass forward to a new generation. And Stan took that into his life and certainly expressed it with all of us. So I want to say that about Stan before we get into talking about documentary editions.
Yes. Robert, since the way this is going,
Yeah.
why don't I give Lloyd a chance now to talk about his relationship with Stan and his,
Sure.
and then we'll get back to the other subjects.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alan, and thanks to Mary and Robert for describing the life experiences that shaped Stan's interest in history and his commitment. I came to Stan sort of haphazardly in that I was a graduate student at Cornell. And the associate editor of the project, Roger Smith, had been badly injured in an accident. And so they needed someone to step in. And I was asked to do this by one of the people who had helped to recruit Stanley Idzerda to come to Cornell, which was Stephen Kaplan, who had worked with Stan at Yale. And I immediately felt myself drawn to Stan, I think because he was easy to talk to. He could be a little crusty. He was certainly opinionated, but he wanted to know about your own life story. And I had gone to a small college in Tennessee, and I think he appreciated that I had come also from kind of outside that world of Northeastern academia. And what I learned from Stan, because I was in my second year of graduate school at Cornell, was the importance of primary sources, that you can't just talk about the world. You have to ground what you say in carefully documented information. And that is a value that I think is all the more important in our own time, but it underlay the whole Lafayette project. And the second thing he would stress was that the meaning of historical figures evolves across time. And although Lafayette may represent a certain position in historical studies, the more we know about him, the more that we might be able to change the way people understand him. And I appreciated that about Stan because he stressed that history was dynamic. It was not frozen. It was always evolving. Historical knowledge has to be revisited, and that's the importance of these collections. The other thing about Cornell was that it had collected a large number of Cornell documents. A man named Arthur Dean, who had been a graduate of Cornell, actually originally from Ithaca, had become a very wealthy and successful lawyer. He had been involved in diplomatic affairs. He somehow had the money to buy a huge collection of Lafayette materials that ended up at Cornell. And that was the link to Cornell. They actually had in the library a large collection, which was supplemented by a lot of other documents. And finally, I just want to say that Stan would ask me about my own philosophy of life, about what was important to me, about where I thought I might go, that he saw historical study as part of a life process, not just an abstract or remote academic process. And all of these aspects of Stan's personality and personal commitments and historical commitments became a model for me in terms of professional historical work.
Thank you, Lloyd. I want to go back to Robert for a moment and ask him to describe the project and what the importance of the 5 volumes that was produced in the project was for the study of Lafayette.
Well, let's start by talking about historical documentary editions. For the first, let's say, 150 years of American historians, there were various collections of Lafayette letters around. Lafayette's family had done a 6-volume edition. A president of Harvard named Jared Sparks had done a collection of Lafayette's letters and Washington's letters. And so there were these bits and pieces of letters. And in the late 40s, the president of the United States, Harry Truman, had even though he didn't have that much of a formal education, had a tenacious interest in history, especially Thomas Jefferson. And so because he was president and in a position to do so, convinced the director of the library at Princeton to do an edition of Thomas Jefferson's papers there that would involve an exhaustive search of all existing Thomas Jefferson letters to and from him. Now, up to that point, most people writing about Thomas Jefferson had simply used the collection of Jefferson's letters that had ended up at the Library of Congress. But that was not a complete collection. So this librarian, Julian Boyd, set about to do a comprehensive edition of Jefferson's papers. And this inspired other Americans to create similar projects. There was the Adams Family Papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which decided to publish collections of those papers. But the idea was that we could get a more complete vision of who the person was by gathering these papers. Well, as time appeared for the bicentennial of the American Revolution in the early 70s, Gottschalk was convinced to undertake a collection of these letters that it would have as its impetus a volume that identified all the existing Lafayette letters in the United States. And the French government undertook to do another one of letters in France. And this appeared in 1975. And those letters were collected from all over the United States, historical societies, state archives, branches of the federal government, even private autograph collectors, which would provide people with a comprehensive view of that person. Because you see, the original editions, either that by Jared Sparks or the Lafayette family, had eliminated from those letters things that Lafayette's had written that might make people uncomfortable. Well, Stan was chosen to institute this series, and it started out, again, grants from the federal government, from a federal commission that is a National Historical Records and Publications Commission, the NHPRC, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. We talk a lot about federal agencies these days. I think what we need to realize is these founding fathers projects, which have now been expanded to all kinds of Americans in American history, would not have been possible without support from the federal government and some matching monies from supportive individuals and corporations. So what they provide historians is a much more complete picture of the individual around whom they're built. And so that's what Stan's project was intended to do, was to provide a source for scholars who wanted to work on Lafayette. It was a selected edition, so we didn't publish every letter, but we had at the back of each volume a list of the letters that were not published with a summary of the contents, so people could decide for themselves, if they were doing research on Lafayette, which other letters they might use. And so those historical documentary projects continue. Of course, as I said in another context, Aaron Burr was responsible for ending the Alexander Hamilton project rather early, but the George Washington Papers project, the Thomas Jefferson project, the Adams project, those are still going on. So those provide us, in a series of volumes, a pretty comprehensive view of not only the letters these people wrote, but the letters they received. So we have a better sense of their thought process than we had. And if you'll notice, this flurry of Lafayette books over the last couple of generations, many of them have depended on the Lafayette Papers projects volumes for their work.
Well, thank you, Robert. I want to ask Lloyd the next question. Lloyd, what did Mr. Idzerda and what did you find in the papers collected in the Lafayette Papers project that perhaps led to a different interpretation of Lafayette than was current at the time the project started?
So we were working on the project at a time when social history was at a kind of peak of influence, and most historians were not very interested in biographical work or in the role of particular individuals. They were more interested in structures. Also, Lafayette was mostly viewed as a kind of lightweight who had not really been very effective during the French Revolution. And what I got from Stan was that if we look at these letters, and of course we were only looking at the period of the 1770s and early 1780s, so we didn't really move beyond that on the project. But if we looked at these letters, we could see that he was a remarkably engaged outsider and that the image of Lafayette as a lightweight was not fair. It was not an accurate account of his role, and that if he was taken so seriously by people from Washington on down in the American Revolutionary Movement, he must have been a talented, thoughtful, insightful person. And we needed to think about what that would mean. So for me personally, that became the motivation to begin looking at Lafayette's career far beyond the period of the American Revolution and rethinking his role as a cross-cultural mediator, as a cross-cultural symbol, and especially as an advocate of freedom, of liberty, of constitutional processes. And therefore, Stan gave us the encouragement to do something new, not just to repeat what the ascendant historical perspectives would have encouraged us to think. And that was Stan. He was iconoclastic. And you know, his first essay was on iconoclasts and the French Revolution. He was, in a sense, a historical iconoclast who wanted to knock down some of the ruling assumptions about history and especially about Lafayette.
Has Stan's work, which includes the Lafayette Papers project, had an influence on other historians besides yourself?
I think it's helped people understand how important Lafayette's role was during the American Revolution. I think Stan's other work, and I would cite that volume you mentioned from the Queen's Museum exhibit about the return journey. Thank you. There it is. I think in some ways that phase of Lafayette's life, let's say after 1800, and especially in the 1820s, 1830s, has become much more central to the analysis of Lafayette. And that essay you described is part of that rethinking of Lafayette's significance. And for a long time, Lafayette was viewed as an important figure in the American Revolution, which the project reiterates and strengthens. But I think the most important development in Lafayette studies over the last 30 years has been to look at Lafayette's enduring role in transnational political movements, the struggle for liberty, abolitionism, other movements for national independence, long after the American Revolution. And the Lafayette Papers project was a starting point for that. But a lot of the most important work deals with the later period in Lafayette's life.
Thank you. So could we say that Stan's work opened eyes to a fuller or fulsome interpretation of Lafayette for many of our current historians. Is that a fair?
I believe that to be the case, but I would be interested to see what others say. But I think he was willing to challenge a dominant portrait of Lafayette with the documents that enabled him to make that challenge. It wasn't just speculation. It was evidence-based.
Yeah. Robert, what say you about that?
Yes, I think a lot of that, again, was launched not by the Lafayette Papers volumes, but by that earlier inventory of Lafayette letters in America and the companion volume, which was done by the French National Archives under Madame Toutier-Bonazzi. Because what these did is they provided the key to where these other letters and documents were. And so a lot of historians have been able to follow up through that those initial inventory volumes. By the way, it's important to know that the French government didn't follow through completely either, because Madame Bonazzi had prepared 2 volumes, and after the first volume was done, the second volume never appeared. But what these provided scholars with was an easy path to find out where these other documents were and to be able to obtain copies of them. And of course, there were some other Lafayette scholars, such as Sylvia Neely at Penn State, who was able to get to the Lafayette Papers Project office and have access to these other letters in one convenient location. And she came out with a very important book based on her dissertation on Lafayette in this period in French history up until 1825, up to the tour. And so various other scholars have been able to follow up on that work by having ready access to where those documents and those collections of documents could be found. So we know about these little troves of Lafayette documents. And I will say the auction and the autograph market that sells historic letters has been much more positive toward allowing access to those for serious scholars since then. And I've been able to find a lot of letters through the courtesy of these auction houses. I will say this, that the internet has given us ready access to a lot of those resources that were unavailable. And subsequently, say, European collaborations across international boundaries have allowed us access to where Lafayette letters are in their collections. And, it's very easy to obtain a copy of those by the internet in 24 hours, which, if you've ever looked at the original 100 cartons of Louis Gottschalk's papers at the University of Chicago, you realize how little he was able to actually accomplish in 50 years in those conventional ways of doing research. That modern technology brings us all on to a lightning pace.
Thank you, Robert. Mary, do you want to say a few words before we open it up to questioning?
Well, one thing I'll say is I think Dad would be happy. He'd be happy that they're still publishing, they're still doing work on Lafayette. That's what he would want. He was so happy when Lloyd went to Chapel Hill is very proud of that. I mean, it's sometimes I think he adopted people that he worked with. But I think it was purely as a feather in his cap that Lloyd was successful, that Robert was successful. That was his goal. And I think it's good that it continues to be. He's provided stuff for other people to publish. And I think that's what he would have wanted.
Well, thank you, Mary. Chuck, do we have any questions for the group?
Okay, Alan, let me open up for questions. Bear with me 1 second.
Did you share the
Oh.
photo?
I want to share a photograph first, and I want Mary to comment on it. Let me bring that up real quick. Bear with me 1 second. Where did I put that photograph? Oh, my goodness. Here we go. Mary, I want you to comment on this photograph that Lloyd found today that I thought is very interesting. Can everybody see that?
Ah,
Yeah.
oh, that's a lovely picture. That must be when they went to Paris.
Yeah, that looks to be on the Seine,
Yeah.
The 80s, Lloyd took the.
probably in the 80s. Lloyd, do you know more about this photograph?
Yes, it is a picture taken in the summer of 1986, and he had been involved in a study abroad program with the College of St. Benedict. But I like
Yes.
this picture because of the smile. I think Jerry's eyes might have been closed, but there's Notre Dame in the background.
Oh,
Yeah.
And we had just had dinner at the Restaurant Bleu in the Gare de Lyon. And he loved to eat and to enjoy a fine French wine. Let me just point that out. And
That and
that's where that picture
Calvados.
was taken. And I think it's important to see that smile because that's what really kept the Lafayette Papers going, was that Stan knew how to smile and he loved to just talk about lots of things. So thank you for sharing that picture. Yes. And you
Yeah.
can see they're like I don't know what that's like. Hadley and Ernest Hemingway in Paris in 1923.
Well, and I got to point out that Mom and Dad took a whole bunch of kids to southern France, and they acted as guardians during that time period. And all us kids were like, "Are you nuts?" Because that was a big responsibility, all those women that they were taking care of. But they did it, and they had a great time. And I'm so glad to be able to see that picture. That's beautiful, beautiful.
Okay, let me see if I can't somebody might want to unmute themselves and ask a question.
Chuck, Dale Henley.
Okay, Dale, how you doing?
Good evening, Dale Henley, Lexington, KY. We're getting ready to celebrate the 200th anniversary of his visit to Lexington in May. Of course, we invite anybody and everybody to come and participate with us. This is my question. I've read a number of books, many of which were mentioned tonight. I know Lafayette was one of the world's most prolific letter writers, but I have yet to see a single letter from him to his great-grandfather, who survived his time in America. Any comments on that?
I don't know who was which.
The Count de la Rivière.
I don't know about that myself. Do you know, Robert? When was she born?
It was his mother's grandmother who really was responsible for his formation in the Black Musketeers. You would think that he would have corresponded.
Oh, yes, from the family from Brittany.
Yes.
La Rivière. Yes.
I've never seen any published letters in any of the books that I've read from Lafayette to his great-grandfather.
I
There's a project for somebody.
I don't think those letters exist.
Well,
Now-
but I preference my comment by saying he's one of the most prolific letter writers. He wrote to everybody. Why would he not have corresponded with somebody as important to him in his life as his great-grandfather?
Because we have very few of the letters from his pre-American travels. In fact, there are very few letters at Cornell. There are a few letters to his mother, some to his aunt, de Chavignac, Madame de Chavignac. But there are, as I have sought, no letters from the La Riviere branch. And again, that's a big loss. But I think this points up a couple of things. One is that historians have to deal with gaps in terms of scholarship, but there is a hope there that there are letters that always turn up. You know, we're still finding Lafayette letters that nobody knew existed. But yeah, it's not only the La Riviere family, but the Lusignan family, those Breton nobles that Lafayette was so proud of, that almost ended getting him in the Bastille in 1788.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Dale. Some more questions, folks. You can unmute yourselves and ask a question.
Let
If
me
you're
just
having
make
trouble-
one passing
Go ahead, Lloyd.
observation.
Yep.
It's so striking that we have as many letters as we do. And nowadays, I think about this, people are using social media and email and everything is vanishing. What will the future historians deal with? They won't have letter collections like this. I just put that up as an aside.
Thank you, Lloyd. This is fascinating stuff. Thank you very much.
Chuck, I have
Any other? Oh, go ahead, Paul. It's good to see you, Paul.
Thank you. Good to see you all. First of all, I want to thank Robert Crout for doing one thing that was talked about, and that's passing it on to the next generation. Robert, I appreciate your helping me with something, and Mr. Kramer also, the emphasis on going to the primary sources. And along those lines, maybe it was you, Robert, who mentioned how when I think you said the French were looking at publishing Lafayette letters, maybe the family, they took out quite a number of things, particular subjects or whatever that they thought might upset people. What has that gone anywhere? Has anyone gone back and been able to get those out, or are they still hidden?
Well, what I was talking about were, let's say, phrases or references in letters that were deleted by the editors. And in fact, if you've looked at the Lafayette Papers volumes, you'll see what we've done is we've restored some of those references or names that were deleted in the original appearance of those letters to their complete text. So even way back in the 1970s, we were interested in saying, not what did people later on think, but what was the totality of the letters. And this is even truer in Lafayette's letters after 1815, where he's living under repressive regimes and more or less for the rest of his career, even under the supposedly enlightened reign of Louis Philippe, there's a lot of hostility toward Lafayette. And those parts of the published Lafayette memoirs that we have covering those letters are highly edited. The problem for us is that has traditionally been the source of scholarship. So if you look at most French editions, French biographies of Lafayette, they're still citing those defective sources. And the result is a very stilted view of Lafayette because you don't get the full intent of the letters. So I'm hoping that at some point in the future, someone will support making that whole historical composite of Lafayette's correspondence available. Not simply the limited selected edition we did at Cornell, because there's a lot of juicy information in those. And hopefully there'll be some benefactor who will sustain that. Of course, remember, the Lafayette Papers project would not have been possible from private sources. It required government financing, as I said, from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission and the National Endowment for the Humanities to even make that limited edition possible. We're talking about huge resources.
So could I just note one other thing about why the Lafayette Papers project seems important to me as an example, not only of the importance of support for documentary collections, but as an example of how historical study is a dynamic field that gives us resources and perspectives that are empowering for our own lives. That is to say, if we simply understood the way Lafayette was perceived in the late 19th century or the early 20th century, he wouldn't be such a dynamic or significant figure for people in our own time. But when we engage with Lafayette's ideas and notice aspects of his life that other historians overlooked because they were concerned with him as a military leader or maybe as a failed political leader during the Revolution, if you limit yourself to what other people have understood about a historical figure, you don't recognize the complexity of history itself. And what the Lafayette Papers project did was open up a possible expansion of the meaning of a figure who had not been properly engaged with by later generations of historians. In other words, he had become either a cliche, oh, the great hero of two worlds, or a kind of symbol of failure. But none of these historical traditions did justice to the importance or complexity of Lafayette. And even though the Lafayette Papers project focused only on that period of the 1770s and 1780s, it opened the door to a rethinking of a historical figure that we're all engaged with now in a way that we couldn't have been before.
No, thank you.
Could
Well said.
I add something on that? And it's we've talked a lot about Lafayette the man, but also Lafayette the family man. You see, this is something people hadn't gotten into. They know he was an orphan, but what they tend to forget is that he had a very large family, and Americans were always impressed that at the dinner table, his daughters, and especially Americans noted his granddaughters, would speak English and engage in talking about politics and other controversial issues. Because we don't tend to think about Lafayette, the family man, the man who, even after the loss of his wife, still engaged with his children, his grandchildren, their families, and so forth. He was a family man. So if anybody ever wonders, well, why didn't Lafayette come to America in those terrible times in France? All they had to do was to look to what his family meant to him.
Good point.
Okay, we're coming up on the hour mark. I will say this, though, nobody's gotten off the Zoom. We've been steady with the participants for a long time now, so people are entertained, and I'm very happy to see that. Does anybody have any more questions for this illustrious group of people?
Any chances that the 6th volume will be published?
There's a question. There's that question.
Hope springs eternal.
Robert, what period of time would it cover if it was published?
Well, we projected that that 6th volume would go from Lafayette's becoming a member of the Emancipation Society of Pennsylvania in January of 1786, all the way to his resignation from command of the French National Guard, or the Parisian National Guard.
Wow.
Because you see that speech that he gives, where he turns over power after the enactment of the French Constitution, is a Washingtonian moment.
Mhm. Very good.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
Well,
you.
I think, Mary, do you have some more?
No,
This went exactly how I had hoped it would. This was oh wait, here's a, we got a nice comment. Somebody said this is a great discussion, very insightful. Thank you. And thank you. And that's a great way to say thank you to everybody for being on this call. And it was very, very well attended. We have over 50 attendees for this, so I can't thank you enough. Thank you, President Hoffman, for doing a masterful job as you always do. Lloyd, Robert, thank you for all your hard work on making sure we know more about Lafayette than anybody else does. And Mary, just thank you for being willing to do this and share so many intimate things about your life and your dad. And it was very, very, very fun to hear all those things. Thank you so much.
well, that picture made my day, so thank you.
Well, I'll make sure Lloyd sends that your way. It'll probably find its way in our next Gazette, though. So don't you should be on the outlook for that.
No, I can't wait to see it.
So again, we'll be in Harrisburg. Our next events are February 1st and 2nd in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We're very excited. And then hang on to your hat, folks, because Lafayette gets going again at the end of February, and we head south. So until then, Lafayette200.org. Thank you very much. And as I always say, Viva Lafayette. I'll be sending out the recording in the days to come. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Viva
Always a
Lafayette.
pleasure to
Viva
talk
Lafayette.
about Lafayette and Stanley Idzerda.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think Stan would
Stanley Idzerda.
enjoy this kind of conversation.
Oh,
Yes.
Thank you
it would
so
go
much.
on for another 2 hours, trust me.
A dynamic duo.
Oh, and I want to thank two more people, and that's Eileen and Joe Volpe. Thank you so much for helping make this happen. Thank you both. We
And
love you.
Bonnie, the indomitable Bonnie Fritz,
Don't
who's
forget
always
Bonnie.
managing
Yes.
like a puppet to manage the technology.
Well, she's in the other room. You made her giggle, Lloyd. Thank you. And